Again, we're so happy, and I know everything is going to be wonderful here, and we're going to have a great, informative night. So, let me introduce and call forward our city manager, Todd Hartman, and let's get started. Thank you.
I did meet Anisha one time. You don't want to meet her. You really don't. Thank you, and I see some familiar faces, I think, through the time or two I've been out here. So, good evening. How's everybody? So, Anisha said I was supposed to also cover the Brexit deal and what that means to the folks at Four Seasons. So, I am working on that as well. That'll be phase 2 of our presentation tonight. Need to get the clicker. So I did have one of my favorite graduate professors that gave me some instruction. He said, Todd, when you become a professional in the field, make sure that if you cannot be brief, you're going to be funny. And my wife has assured me I'm neither brief nor funny, so I must apologize to you. I'm not sure I passed that. But, you betcha. Is that better? Okay. And please keep reminding me to do that, because I haven't. Okay, so since we had our last presentation, we've actually had quite a few additional developments on Melrose, and some of those factors that specifically address each of you homeowners here within this development. But let me introduce the experts that I have with me tonight. Webb & Associates is the city's special tax consultants, and they help us prepare the tax statements, and they help us submit all the paperwork and take care of everything you can imagine related to managing our Melrose program from the very beginning all the way through continual management of that. So with us tonight we have Heidi Shepping, Matt Chesney, and Zaire Marin. And Brent Howard is actually in the back walking his way up towards the table right now. So our objective tonight is to give you an overview of where we are with the Melrose program with the city, specifically for Four Seasons, and then to try to field as many questions as we can this evening. So are y'all ready to get started? So I've been here since October 31st of 2016, and so after we took care of some other business when I first got here, we started talking to council about a program to provide what relief we could to the Melrose program. And so a lot of elements of the program had been restructured, and one of the key policy shifts that occurred was not trying to maximize each one of the Melrose areas in terms of generating what revenue we could out of it. It was really more tied towards trying to size any potential bond issues or revenues coming out of the Melrose program to address very specific things. The other thing that council is very concerned about and remains concerned about is where we have these 2% escalators on the facilities components. And again, under the original construct, the Melrose program was structured so that each improvement area or each area for which a development occurred was being maxed out in terms of how much bond revenues could be generated within that area. So a major shift was to say there needs to be a basis by which we're looking at what types of funds should be generated and then specifically how they should be deployed. But this slide really gives you an overview of what the council policy looks like as we move forward today. Now, when we started working on this a couple of years ago, the first thing we did was to analyze what bonds that were sold could be refinanced. And the purpose of that refinance was for savings. So we established some baseline for savings. And then we looked at it and said, okay, can we structure it for those savings and structure it to create level debt service so you didn't have that escalating situation that was happening year over year. So that was that effort to equalize the payments and to try to address that. Where we couldn't refinance, we restructured the debt to achieve the same thing. Where we had existing bonds sold, some of those areas still had additional bonds that could be sold or were supposed to be sold. And when you sell bonds, that's an initial sell. Additional bond sales are what they call parity bonds. So when we sold additional amounts, don't sell what we could, size it to what was appropriate to what needed to be done, and then again to structure that so that we were trying to create a level basis for these payments moving forward. And the final thing was trying to develop transparency. So I won't bore with a lot of details, but the financial tracking and reporting systems in the city were very minimal when I got here. So we've been restructuring a lot of issues with regard to financial reporting, with regard to tracking. Specific to Roos, we're working on some models now that we're putting into the budget that starts July 1 for next year to begin looking at, okay, specifically for each improvement area, what's coming in, how that's being deployed. But I will say that a large portion of the revenues that come in are going towards existing debt service. So there's very little cash that's coming in that goes to anything else above and beyond that. So we're going to describe that a little bit later. So what I mentioned was that the city council a couple years ago said, okay, let's analyze this. Where can we achieve relief for our taxpayers? And one of the things that we did was we evaluated every single improvement area. Where there was bonds, could they be refinanced? Where their bonds were not sold or they weren't completely sold, what do we really need in terms of revenues from that area? One of the things to understand is when your CFD is created, there is a process by which it's estimated what the payments will be within the CFD area. And so those are tax collections that have to occur. And they have to happen at the level specified unless and until we bond out and we issue the debt within those areas. And if we issue less and call that a completed funded area, then we can begin to reduce those assessments that were established when the CFD was created. And that's a critical component to the City Council's efforts to manage the CFD program. So again, if you think about that, okay, CFD is created, rates for assessments are set. Those are guarantees to individuals who are loaning money through the bond program, and then we have to guarantee that we're collecting that to pay them back. And those funds are limited or restricted in terms of where they can go. So they have to go towards capital and towards other operational issues that are established as the CFDs are being created. Right? Okay. So if you look, the slide above shows you how many tracks within the city that we actually addressed through the CFD program thus far. So a little over 13,000 single-family units have had some sort of relief or some sort of effort to help to either stabilize or reduce the assessments. And one of the biggest elements that was impacted was what we call the pay-go component. Pay-go is where you may not have bonds sold within your CFD, yet we have to collect the assessment against the properties before they develop or before the bonds are sold. So where we're collecting those monies, those come into the city and those are pay-go because they're not obligated yet. And so with a lot of the areas that were not fully bonded out, or for areas that they were anticipating selling more that we decided not to sell more bonds in, we began taking the pay-goes that were there because they were accumulating over time. And we applied a big chunk of those towards helping to pay down existing outstanding debt that was there. And so a large part of that was actually used to buy down bonds and help to reduce the rates for everybody. So as we look to try to structure these things, we're trying to minimize that pay-go to bring it on down. Through the bond issuance process, we've had about 1,200 lots that actually received some benefit. It sounds crazy. How could you sell bonds and reduce my debt? Again, the rate that's set within your improvement area is expecting full bonding. So as we finish out the bond issuance, the debt for your improvement area, and we don't sell to the max that was established when they created the improvement area, then we don't have to assess as much, and then we have a basis to reduce your rate of collection, which is what we did. And then, ultimately, as we evaluated, there are 2,600 lots that were not ready yet for relief. So we have some outstanding bonds. There's limits in terms of when we can sell them, and when we do evaluate selling them, can we secure savings? Because we don't want to refinance something only to charge you the same amount of money or have the same assessments or even a higher assessment. So again, the idea here is to provide as much relief as we can. So the CFDs have 3 different types of CFDs that are out there. So if you look at your tax statement, you'll see several different types of assessments. So the first one, which is most commonly discussed, that had I think the majority of concern over the years, it's I've been here, been the facilities portion. And so those are bonds that are assessed to pay for or reimburse the developer for improvements that they actually make to facilitate the sort of subdivision. They have a timeline. They cannot exceed 40 years of life. So there's a specific endpoint that those bonds or that CFD assessment can actually occur. And it starts from the time that we create the CFD. There's 50 years that you can assess, but a maximum of 40 years, if that makes sense. So we have a services CFD, and that's an ongoing in perpetuity assessment. The purpose of that is to go towards infrastructure maintenance. Some areas have public streets within them, landscape berms. There's other community facilities, not necessarily within your subdivision, park systems, things like that, that those funds go to help to support. And then the newest one that's been added about a year and a half ago is a public safety assessment. So 2614 is one of 5 improvement areas within 4 seasons. That's the only one that has a public safety assessment. So the others don't have this assessment. But that is a specific CFD assessment that goes towards paying for police and fire protection. So if you look at this map, what it shows you graphically is where the different improvement areas within 4 seasons are located. So 7A1 is you can see it on the north side off of Potrero. 7B is the next one over. 7B also has to the north of it a vacant tract that was included that is undeveloped. And then you got 7C and 7D. And then in the middle, this image is a little older, but where the dirt work is, that's the 2016-4. So that was a new CFD formation. So instead of continuing on with the 93-1 of the individual improvement areas, council said, hey, let's start to create individual new CFDs and try to address and take care of some of the practices and things that are happening in the past, so we can get into restructuring these to be more consistent with where the council is looking to go. So in looking at finalizing some bonds that we needed to sell to finish out the bond sales for 7B and 7D, in addition to trying to eliminate pay-go where we could and to do the other savings things that we talked about, the assessments were set up for this year. So if you look at this table, you can see what the assessments changes were from 16-17 to this year, which is the 18-19 fiscal year. And so what you'll see in 7A1, there was a total reduction of 6% from 17 to 18-19, then 22% for 7B, 9% for 7C, and 7D had a 1% bump in 7D. And then 2614 is new. We just formatted that one and it just started assessing taxes for this year. And then you can see the relative assessments. You can see they're not level, they're not even. And the reason for that is when facilities were being constructed and facilities were being addressed, there were certain projects that were occurring as each phase of development was occurring. And so there were facilities reimbursements back to the developers for different pieces of infrastructures that came across. And we can go into that in a little bit more detail. And then I'm going to kind of touch on this very lightly and then turn it over to Ms. Sheppy to provide you more detail. We have some specific detail for each one of the improvement areas and for 2016-4 to kind of give you an overview of how all that works. But in terms of the total revenues that are coming in for this year, there's $2.2 million coming in. Out of that, $1.3 million is going towards debt service. And then we have other administrative and other obligations for collections. It's all driven towards the debt service payment. And what you'll see is that future facility piece, which is $115,000. That's that piece, that's that PAYGO piece that we talked about. So out of the $2.1 million, all but $115,000 of it goes towards debt service or the cost to service that debt. Out of that 101,000 is 2016-4. And there's PAYGO building in 2016-4 because there's a bond sale that will occur in 2016-4 on into the future. We're actually evaluating that right now. There's a process we're going through. So only 15,000 of that PAYGO is coming from improvement areas 7A1, 7B, 7C, and 7D. So nearly all of it is going towards that. And I know there's probably some questions that are going to come up about where did some of that money go. So we'll be happy to address that. But before we get there, I'd like to turn it to Ms. Sheppy to walk you through some of the specifics.
Okay, good evening, everyone. If you can't hear me, there you go, got it. Can you hear me now? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so Todd touched on these items. The future facilities amount, as you mentioned, majority of that is for CFD 2016-4, and we will enroll all of those properties at their assigned rate until we sell the final series of bonds. We anticipate the first issuance to also be the last issuance. So once that occurs, hopefully in the not too distant future, there will be no more future facilities collected within the Four Seasons community. You had a small portion of future facilities here remaining in improvement area 7B and, sorry, that should say 7D, which was collected last year because the enrollment was prior to the final issuance of debt for those two improvement areas. So now that we've issued the final series of debt in all 7A1, B, C, and D, none of those improvement areas, per direction of City Council, will be having their future facilities enrolled. So that will no longer be a line item in the budget, and that allows for that reduction in your special tax. So to be more specific, improvement area 7A1. Improvement area 7A1 does not have an escalator. It has been fully bonded. We have 486 homes in that improvement area. At 2018-19, your average assessment was around $1,480. And over the past 2 years, the City Council has made decisions to allow for a 6% reduction from 16-17. Improvement Area 7B, this is one that we recently finalized the final series of bonds. This one had a 2% escalator, so you noticed in the sheet for 16-17, 17-18, you had that 2% bump. When we issued the final series of debt, the city and the City Council elected to even out your debt by making sure that everything was level with the final series of bonds. So that means that in the future, your debt service payment won't be required to escalate by 2%. So they also made sure to give you a reduction to what they could based on the facilities that were proposed to be financed through the final issuance, which allowed for that 22 to 24% reduction. Improvement Area 7C, we have not been able to provide any refunding in this improvement area because the bonds are not refundable until 2022, which actually isn't too far away. So if interest rates are good in that time and they're lower than what's currently outstanding, then that might be a candidate for refunding. The city has, however, eliminated the PAYGO that was enrolled for Improvement Area 7C. So you were able to see a little bit of a reduction with the removal of the PAYGO for future facilities. Improvement Area 7D has also seen its final series of bonds issued. So all bonds have been issued in Improvement Area 7D. There's no escalator in Improvement Area 7D, so what you're seeing on your property tax bill should remain fairly stable through the life of the bonds, which are set to mature in 2048. CFD 2016-4 is currently being developed. It was formerly Improvement Area 7E. However, when the developer came to the city to discuss Improvement Area 7E, the city said, well, we have these new policies, we want to make sure on a go-forward basis that all of the new CFDs and bond issuances are in line with these policies. So we created a new CFD in place of that improvement area. The new CFD has no escalator, has rates that are established to maintain a 2% or lower effective tax rate, and also has that new public safety component to their special tax. That one's in the process of being developed, and we intend or plan to, in the not too distant future, do that debt issuance. Okay, so that's it for the really exciting details. I'm going to turn it back over to Todd, and then he can go over some of the more general city stuff. And then I imagine you guys will have some more questions and some detailed stuff, so we'll be available for questions after.
She likes the clicker. So, one of the things that is important to note is the services CFDs. Why are they created? And really, cities are, in Beaumont in particular, have created those because there needs to be additional revenues being generated to help cover ongoing operations and maintenance expenses within the subdivisions as well as throughout the city. And if you are a little familiar with how taxation works in California, in particular with Riverside County, what happens is as new projects are annexed and developed, which in many cases, that's kind of been the rule of thumb in Beaumont, the county actually keeps about 75% of the property taxes that are generated that go towards public services. So the city's portion of that is only 25%. So when you look at your overall property tax assessment and property tax collected, very little is actually coming to the city. So the level of service really far outstrips the additional revenues that are coming in. So again, how do we address that issue? And so as these CFDs are created, there's an analysis that's done that looks at what the expected level of services would be, and then what assessments would need to occur to cover that. And so if you look at the forever CFD assessments that are established for the services, with the exception of 2016-4, the CFD assessments are $329 for the year for those. And those do have escalators. Those can go up to 5% from year to year. What we're doing is we're trying to budget those to right size what those actual adjustments should be moving forward. 2016-4 is different. Like I mentioned, that was the first one in this Four Seasons subdivision that has the public safety CFD. So that one is actually $512. That one is actually higher right now for these services CFDs than the others. But the others are paying a lot more facilities than 2016-14 is. But if you look at where Beaumont has gone, this is a historical snapshot that shows you where the assessed value, where the property value is that's generating these property tax collections coming into the city. And to put this into a little bit more context, the city's general fund, which is the portion of the fund that takes care of all the typical city services issues, is about $35 million this year. Property taxes only generate about $4.8 million of that. So really a small portion of the revenues that come in to operate the general fund actually come from property taxes. What you'll see if you look at this schedule, you notice the dip that occurs starting in 2008 and goes through 2013. That's the effect of Prop 8 and Prop 13, which were state statutes that were established to try to help keep California affordable. And what that does is it adjusts your assessed value downward on the basis of market value. So as we get into economic downslides and downturns, then your property assessments go down and the property tax bills coming in go down. So it makes it very volatile for a city like Beaumont that is about 80% of our property tax value is single-family residential. And so there's large swings with regard to how that happens. So we're budgeting and we're calculating what those swings look like over time. So this is what your actual property tax revenues look like from 2004 through 2018. And again, you see the dip that happened. So even though we continue to have growth, we actually have less property tax revenue coming in. And as I mentioned, as our forecast is looking forward, we don't want to be in these dips anymore. The things that we're delivering and the services that we're delivering, we want to be consistent and we want to have stability there for our citizens. So this shows you what the projected trend would look like in assessments. And so you see some down years that we're preparing for financially. So our sales and use taxes generate about, right now we're generating about $5 million a year in sales and use tax. So we actually bring in more on sales and use than we do on property tax. And so this just shows you that the growth in our property tax has been a little bit better, a little bit more stable, although we've had some downturns. So I'm just presenting that to kind of help provide an illustration that a large portion of the dollars that come in to operate the city are not just property taxes and they're not just sales tax. We're bringing in permits, we're bringing in fees, there's other things that come in to cover those operations. The CFDs, services CFDs, across the entire city generate about another $3.5 million. For last year's 3.2, we think it's closer to 3.4, 3.5 next year as we've had more development coming in. So again, those three components, your CFD assessment, your property tax and sales tax is about a third of what it takes to run the general fund. The rest is coming from other sources. And this just shows you what the actual total general fund revenues we're looking at. And then single family was bringing in these levels, which again maxes out to about maybe a third. So, a large question that I get a lot all over town really is, okay, how are you managing my CFD funds? And how do I know that you're not backing up your Jeep and loading up the cash and taking it out every night? So we've been working through a process to really track your revenues coming in and to track the expenditures. And so we've been documenting that and creating financial reporting systems to look at that. But CFDs are what we consider special revenue funds, meaning when they come in, they just don't go into a general fund to a big pot that we can use anywhere. They are restricted. They are special, and they have to go to specific types of uses, like your debt service payments. If pay-go comes in, it's limited in terms of where it can go. And so we have some basic elements that we are prescribed to us that dictate how we can use those funds. And so on those, we've got administrative. So part of the fees that come in go to, covering our special tax services. It helps to cover some of our financial operations, those types of things. Our maintenance, some of the general maintenance across the city and within the subdivisions. Public safety, again, is a new one that's coming in. Any kind of enhancements, if we have some remaining pay-go, can we apply those funds towards enhancements within a community? And like I said, we've really significantly eliminated pay-go, so there's not a lot of money that's there that's being generated that we can apply. And a lot of that's coming in is actually being set aside for contemplated debt that's coming. So there's not a lot of room in there, but where there may be some, there's some opportunities to try to deploy those funds. So at that point, that kind of is a quick overview of our CFD program. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over and see if y'all are ready for some questions.
Okay, here we go. Roos.
Yes. To the woman in the middle. When you gave your presentation, you said that the 2%, we call it Mello, and I think you're calling it CFD, but I'm not sure the difference. But you said that the escalation of 2% on that would stop. When do you plan that will stop, that 2%?
Well, the escalation will cease for the facilities component for improvement area B, which from last year, 2018-19 to 2019-20, there will not be a 2% increase. So in your fiscal year 18-19 enrollment, you actually saw a decrease in that component of 24% from us reducing that amount and issuing the final series of debt. So from this point on, it may fluctuate slightly, but there is no escalation. The only fluctuation would be that the debt service schedule is as level as they can make a principal and interest calculation. It's not quite like a mortgage. There's varying interest rates, so it slightly varies, but it's within a small range.
You lost him because I thought when you gave the presentation that you said that it would de-escalate at 2%. That's what we're paying each time we get our property taxes on it, 2% more.
So we are only in control of that Mello Roos enrollment. So your Mello Roos is one line item on your property tax bill, which is paid for facilities component and services component for majority of the improvement areas. So that facilities component is the one where we've removed that 2% escalator. We technically haven't removed it, we basically just leveled out the requirement. So that component of your property tax bill will not escalate by 2%. The services component will continue to escalate by CPI for improvement areas A1, B, C, and D. 16-4, your services component, it escalates by 2% or CPI, whichever is greater. And the public safety component for 16-4 escalates by 5% or CPI to calculate the maximum assessment. It's not necessarily what the city will enroll, but it does allow them to increase to an amount to recover costs that are inflated due to contracts or police and fire needs. So sounds high, but they don't necessarily have to enroll that amount if it's not needed when we calculate the budget. Now, your annual assessed value at the county will continue to escalate on an annual basis at 2%. And you have another component on your tax bill that's enrolled by the county that is a 1%, give or take a little bit if there's other general obligations. So it might be like 1.3. That will continue to be based on that increased assessed value. So that's all done by the county. We really have no control over how they do that. We just provide for that CFD enrollment, which is that special tax line item on your tax bill.
And I think it's important because it is confusing. There's so many layers and elements to your tax bill. So your property tax assessments for your general property tax that goes to the county, part of that comes to the city, goes to the hospital district, to the various taxing entities that are out there. Those may fluctuate based on your assessed value, based on your Prop 8 and Prop 13 evaluation process. The Mello or the CFD assessments are fixed. So those are established. So if we're not escalating them, you know that you relatively have a relatively constant CFD or Mello's assessment from year to year. So where you see those other fluctuations would be in those other elements of your tax rate, if that makes sense.
Are the Mello rules part of what a city decides? I came from a city that didn't, and a planned development community where we do not have Mello rules.
I guess I'll kick that one off. So the Mello rules, or the formation of community facilities districts, the way that usually works is that you have a developer that wants to develop a community, and they come to the city and say, hey, we want to put this new development in, we want to have these improvements. So the city will either agree or not agree to allow them to create this special tax district to assist in paying for some of those facilities that are required in order to develop that community. So there's, some cities that say Mello Roos, they have a bad name to them, we don't want them, we don't need them. There are other cities that say these things, these districts, various types of special tax districts can provide for a development in our community and can provide for homes for people where it may not have been affordable to develop for a developer. So they agree that these districts may be beneficial to the property owners at that time to provide for those facilities. When a district is formed, the property owners are required to be provided with disclosure. So it's not something that should be a surprise to a property owner when they're buying their home. You're supposed to review the document and sign it even when you purchase your home. So, it should have been disclosed to the property owners.
It was just, I moved from an area where there were not the Mello rules.
Yes, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a vote, and 7A1, where I live, was voting on whether or not they were going to freeze the Mello Roos where it was and restart the 30-year clock, or continue with a 2% escalation from the original clock. And I don't think we've ever gotten an answer as to whether or not that happened or not. And if so, is there anything to be done about that? Some of us, who are in houses that were built in 2005, didn't really appreciate a new 30-year clock starting.
So yes, the vote occurred, and there was a bond that was sold in 2015 in the amount of $10.2 million. And the structure for that debt was a 30-year program. So the bonds that were sold are not callable until 2025. So we couldn't try to refinance them for some more years under that program. But when that debt was sold, the 2% escalator was removed. So the vote occurred in 2015, bonds were sold, and then they were set up with a 10-year callable feature to them. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, council's been looking into when they can continue to refinance bonds that come up. And there are certain thresholds that they establish for refinancing those. The ultimate objective is to save you money. And one other major policy decision that they made was not to sell bonds that were going to continue to extend the debt service schedule. So if that were to come to us today, we would look at it and say, okay, can we refinance this? Can we save you at least 3% or better? And can we structure this bond sale in a way that doesn't extend the life of your bond? So those are the components that would happen today. But in 2015, the bonds were sold and it was implemented just as y'all had voted in that referendum.
Area 7B. Now 7B was built out, the last house in that area was sold right around the end of 2014.
We can't hear you.
In 2014, the last houses were sold in area 7B. Yet at the end of 2018, almost another $3 million was added as a bond for improvement for that area. I'd like to know why. I'd like to know what that does to our taxes. Does that increase our Mello? And also, could you please clarify the 2% escalation, exactly what, there are two different escalations, one to the Belarus, one to the service, and another one, exactly, because what I understand, I thought you said that 7B, the escalation did not go away, so that we still have the escalation. So could you please clarify that? And as I said, why the $3 million added? 4 years after the track is completed, the escalation, and if our taxes will be increased because of that. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack, so let me work through, and then if I miss anything, please help me clarify so we can address that. So the first is the 2% escalator on the facilities. So 7B has a 2% escalator that's allowed through the, what we call the RMA. That's the rate-making assessment that was done when the improvement area was created. Okay. So what that RMA allows your tax rate to do, the total assessment by the RMA is allowed to grow from a maximum assessment of $330,000 for this year. It can grow up to $587,000 by 47-48. Okay? So it can almost double within that time period. So what the city council did, that improvement area was not fully financed yet. So we had to collect at the max rate that was established for that improvement area. So the city council said, hey, we want to structure that debt to finish that out and to level out the debt service. what they call wrapping, right? So what they did is they said, hey, we talked to Ms. Sheppy, and we said, hey, help us figure out, please, what is actually needed and how much can we actually reduce that assessment. So City Council established a threshold of about $310,000, $311,000 of assessment that they'd be willing to implement for the project, for that improvement area. So bonds were sold in 2012. There's 2 series of bonds that were sold that 7B pays a portion of. And that escalates, the debt service limit escalates through 2038, 2039. So the new bonds that were sold take the debt service with the other related components of that assessment up to no more than 310. So those bonds were sold that actually resulted in capping the total assessment at 310. Which actually resulted in significant savings and significant reduction of the assessments for this year as well as for all the future years. So it was structured in a way to basically have the same net effect of keeping your debt service level. So even though there's an escalator, we didn't allow the debt to escalate that way. So the question is, why did we sell bonds after so many years after the improvements were completed? And the bottom line for that is we have development agreements for all these subdivisions throughout the city. The development agreements specify that the developers are allowed to be reimbursed for improvements that they make that serve the subdivision. And so the development agreement for Four Seasons through K. Hovnanian is built that same way. So there was still a balance of about $11 or $12 million of capital that the developer could have been eligible and could have requested reimbursement for. We said, no, we're not going to do that. Let's identify what you can qualify for reimbursement. We're only going to be willing to reimburse you for an amount that caps us and does not require us to escalate that debt service payment. So that significantly reduced what the developer was going to get. So they qualified for another roughly $12 million of reimbursement. They only got the $3 million out of this. And they agreed to these agreements. They had actually been eligible for reimbursement for over 10 years of the capital that they put in. And the city didn't sell the bonds. And as a result of that, everybody in that area was required to be assessed at that max rate. So by doing this and going through that process, we effectuated a level debt service, and we reduced your assessment because we were able to finalize that.
Yes, hi. Apparently I'm in the CFD to 2016-4, and that's going to have an increase of 5% and 2%, and is there a cap on that?
So CFD 2016-4 has a facilities component that does not have an escalator, and right now it's being enrolled at your assigned rate. So your home is assigned a rate based on the square footage of your home, and that is the rate that you're going to be assessed until we sell the final series of bonds. That's your component 1. Component 2 is a services component. So when CFD 2016 was formed, 2016-4 was formed, we worked with the developer and they provided a maintenance worksheet of all the maintenance that is in that 2016-4 area. And that computed an amount for an annual enrollment to make sure that we could support the maintenance within that improvement or that CFD area. That component increases at CPI or 2% on an annual basis. So the maximum assessment of that component, I should say, will increase at 2% or CPI. The city will, on an annual basis, prepare a budget based on their contracted rates from their landscaping and maintenance that are required. and they will provide the budget to us, and that will allow us to calculate the actual enrolled amount, which may or may not be that maximum assessment. So they have the ability to enroll a lesser amount if a lesser amount is needed. The city is working on their calculation of specifically how they're going to allocate those amounts.
So the city is going to maintain our area?
They maintain the general network of park and maintenance areas that are not within the gated community, but that are of benefit to those property owners. So there's neighborhood parks, there's city landscaping, median maintenance, and then there's the component for the public safety, which does have the maximum escalator of 5% or CPI on an annual basis. The reason that escalator is higher is because the inflation rate of public safety services is generally higher than the inflation rate of something like a maintenance services contract. So we allow for that additional escalation and inflation to ensure that we can provide those services.
And this is the only area that has that.
2016-1, 2016-2, 2016-3, 2016-4, 2018-1, and then 2019-1, upcoming 2019-2. So all of the new development that's coming in to have financing, they're being required to pay for the public safety, which when you're looking at the total capacity of a tax bill, the city has a policy not to exceed 2%. So if a portion of that is going now towards public safety, that reduces the amount that they're allowed to put towards facilities. So it actually limits the developer's ability to pay for their infrastructure by requiring them to pay for the public safety services through the property tax bill.
So it's going to continue to go up.
The maximum tax will continue to increase, yes.
For 2016-4, the services component enrolled for 18-19 is $72 for the year, for example, versus $329, which is the services assessments for the other CFDs. So there's a lot less services. Now, the 329, part of that that's currently being collected in the other CFD areas, improvement areas, can actually also be applied to public safety. But City Council will establish a very specific special rate for public safety for all the new CFD formations moving forward.
My question is about the city's operations of all of its bonding. And are you remarketing on a fairly frequent basis, whether it's monthly, 6 months, annually, the combination of all the city's bonding, including what's affecting this community? And are we constantly getting the best rate? Second thing is, how frequently are you RFPing the financial management consulting contract, and is that part of the administrative costs we see in the bonds?
So we're in year 2 of a 3-year contract with Webb and Associates. So they just went through a competitive bidding process for special tax consulting. So there are 4 consultants in our consulting team for our CFD program. So the most important one is our special tax consultant. I'm serious. Okay. No, the other is our bond counsel. Another one is our financial advisor. So those are the 3 that really are very crucial to us in making these programs go and work. So, and Webb kind of serves a couple of different roles in there. But one is in helping us analyze the formation of CFDs and determining what's appropriate to set up and looking at impacts. But we are in the process right now of going out to bid. I'm sorry, the 4th one was our underwriter. So we are actually out to bid right now for underwriting services for this year. Next year we'll be going to our bond counsel. And then the next year we'll be going into our financial advisor, and then Webb will come back up again. So we're in a schedule to rebid those processes that are out there. So in terms of, are we getting the best pricing for the bonds that we're selling? We put together with our underwriter a bid package for our bonds. And we go through an exercise, including with Webb, to identify what we need. Our bond counsel helps us identify how we structure these to make sure they're tax exempt for the investor. And then the underwriter helps us put that together. The financial advisor helps us build the overall debt structure and advise us on how to put that together. Then we go out to the open market and bid that. We then hopefully receive an oversubscription for the bonds that we're placing out there. And, for example, if in this one of the last bond sales, on some of the shorter term notes that we were placing, we might have had orders for 2 to 3 times the amount that we actually were offering. On the longer term, in one case, we actually had 6 times the amount of subscriptions for the longer term debt. In some cases, we had just enough to cover how much we were offering, which is the worst case scenario. But ultimately, when you looked at the results and you looked at our costs associated with the bond sale, and you looked at the overall interest rate that we were paying, we were very competitive. So we were right there in the low 4% in terms of our bond sale. So we felt like we were getting competitive pricing, and we got good results on the bonds that we were placing out to the market. Now, one thing to note is that the general fund does not have any bond debt. The utility fund has bond debt that we were using to fund the wastewater treatment plant project that we're doing and the related expenses. So the balance of bonds that we have are the bonds we have outstanding through the CFD program. And that's what we've been refinancing. So, like I said earlier, I think the other part of the question is, as we're evaluating the potential to refinance those bonds, how are we doing that? It's an ongoing, recurring basis. We know what bonds we have coming up that are eligible for refinancing, and so we're tracking that. And with Webb, with our financial advisor, with our underwriter, we're evaluating those to then determine which ones hit the thresholds for the savings that we're trying to accomplish.
Mr. Barton, good evening. Hello. I hope you still remember me. Yes, sir. So please clarify something for us here, or for me, maybe I couldn't hear you right. This Area 7B, we have 2 CFDs. The small one is the service, the large one is the facility. So on which of these 2 the escalation of 2% will apply, please? Both.
For improvement area 7B, we have 2 special taxes. So it's 1 improvement area, 2 special taxes. Facilities special tax will no longer escalate by 2%. Your services special tax will continue to escalate by CPI.
So both will escalate.
No.
All CFDs will escalate. I'm just talking CFDs. There are 2 components of CFD, right?
2
The
components.
small one, the large one. Are you saying both will
The
escalate?
large one will not escalate at 2%.
Okay.
The small one will continue to escalate at 2%. Or CPI.
Okay, thank you. I think. Now, Mr. Barton mentioned the other day on our meeting that city is intending to issue additional bonds on Area 7B. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yes, sir, and that's what I described earlier. We issued bonds in November of 2018. Those bonds finished out the debt for 7B, and it resulted in a 22% reduction to the assessment that's there, and had the net effect of leveling out the debt service obligation for 7B.
My name is Mello. One, I'd like to get copies of that presentation, and I think everybody here would probably like to see that. I do have the facilitation CFD and the services. Services, I guess, are capped at 1.35. With respect to what we're told about servicing debt, and refinancing to gain a better interest rate and so forth. The question I have is, who does the auditing to ensure that the basis for that accrual of the debt is being allocated to the areas that it was supposed to? Because as you know, in the past, monies within the city council and by its hired help were misappropriated. The question, if you're getting $10 or $12 million in additional bonding, is that money being tracked and allocated the way it was supposed to be? And what transparency is taking place? What is being made available to the city people that are paying it? I am paying over $7,500 a year in total taxes for the property, of which $2,365 are for the 2 CFDs. So my concern is that that money that's being refunded to get a lower interest rate is still being allocated the way it's supposed to be and going to the proper services. Another issue that I have is some of those services that we have been getting for 13 years are now being threatened to be pulled from us in 7B and the entire development. That is a great concern to me. Thank you.
All right. Are we ready to dive into those questions? Okay, so your first question, I think, was how do you know your money's going where it's supposed to go, correct? Okay, so we...
Stand up. Excuse me, could you stand up so we can see you too?
Oh, sure.
All we can see is your back.
Oh, that's right. I know, that's not my best feature, is it?
Thank
So, once we sell the bonds, we have funds that are wired to the city. Those funds go to a trustee. They're not held by the city in a city bank account. They go to a trustee. And once we need to make bond payments, or if you remember a couple years ago, we re-implemented the prepayment program. We froze it for a while because we had to figure out how to track all of our finances and figure out reconciliations. So those bond funds come in, they go to a trustee. When it's time to make those payments out of those bond funds, we have to provide backup to the trustee to get those funds released, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that those funds are going where they're supposed to go. And so all that is tracked, all that is booked. There's financial records that show the receipt of the funds coming in, and there's backup that shows where those funds are going. We have an independent auditor that comes in every year. So there's an outside firm that we pay that comes in that audits our books. And so that's some of the things that they look at is, are we making those obligations? Are we making those payments? And so there's a tracking process all the way through. Where folks come in and make their prepayments, then there are certain limits in terms of how much you can pay off at a time. You have to pay off in $5,000 increments. So if somebody comes in, they say, I'm going to pay $12,000 towards my final payment, my prepayment. We can't just pay $12,000. We can, by contract with the bondholders, we can only pay them off in $5,000 increments. So there's some portions of those funds that are remaining. So we may pay $10,000. And then that other $2,000 is held by the trustee until we build up enough to make the next payment. But where those prepayments are made, those calculations are used by Webb to reduce what the overall allocation needs to be to make the debt service payments moving forward. So there is a complete tracking system, and we've got independent eyes looking at our financial operations, and then we have our finance audit committee that oversees a review of the city's audit. They have an opportunity to review that and ask questions. So we've built a tracking system. There's double checks. There are other people that we have to get authorization from in order to even cut checks and to have funds released to be able to put into the places it needs to go. One of the other things that we're working on is on the transparent component is to look at how we're budgeting those other services dollars that are coming in. So in the past, the funds have come in. We've known that overall city operations for park maintenance and other services around the city exceed the revenues that are coming in. But we're drilling down and we're trying to provide more specificity to that process so we can go back and show you, hey, this is how much was generated. This is how we came up with the allocation process for those monies. So we're working to develop that as the next step in that process. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of things and a lot of work that's gone into getting us to this point. And so we're continuing to try to take the steps to improve that and to give you much better information moving forward. So I hope that helped answer some of them. Okay. I gave 6 answers. I don't know what else to do. Okay, we got it.
Todd, I have a question. Could I ask if the cost of refinancing the CFDs has actually exceeded the savings in any given year to the people? I read that it was a very tiny amount of savings, these ones that have been refinanced, and the actual cost of Webb & Associates were huge. So I'm wondering if it's actually costing us as a city and as taxpayers to get these things refinanced. Are we really genuinely gaining by having these things refinanced, or should they just be left alone? And also, the second part of my question, which is probably not to do with the subject matter, but I would like to know where the Prop A money, or whatever they call it, the gas tax money, has gone to as far as the roads go in Beaumont, because the most diabolical road that I hate driving is Pennsylvania. And I just don't think that we can wait for whichever builder it is to refurb that road. I mean, it's horrendous. And it reminds me of the roads I used to have to drive on coming through Emmett and San Jacinto that used to crack up and break up every 3 years. And can we do something about it? I mean, we're getting older, we'd like to drive on a nice smooth road. And I think we were getting gas tax money. You told me we were getting gas tax money, and there was $1 million a year, or $500,000, whatever figure it is. So it's like a two-part question. When are we paying too much to refinance the bonds, and can we have some smooth roads, please? Thank you.
Okay, so the total fees, when we look at a bond issue, probably run about $250,000 to $275,000. And Webb does not get all that money. That goes to underwriter. They take the biggest chunk of those funds. And then our tax consultants, which are Webb, take a small portion of that. So, yeah, they're not getting wealthy over the refinancings. And then we have our bond counsel, so the underwriter and the bond counsel comprise the largest portion of those fees. The way underwriters work is they're charging typically a rate per dollar of value of the bonds that you're proposing to sell. So the cost, the fees associated with those bond sales are about half of what they were before I got here. So we've been working hard to make sure that those fees are reasonable and appropriate. Now, when we talk about the savings and we talk about the overall net effect of those bond sales on your tax rate, it contemplates everything. It looks at the interest that you're going to pay as well as the fees associated with the bond sale. And there's a lot of work that goes into the bond sale before we actually sell, and that's really done on a pro bono basis. So, yeah, we had a couple instances where we actually analyzed and looked at and pre-priced some bonds, and ultimately council decided not to sell those because we could not achieve the savings when we contemplated all those costs. So it is contemplated, it is looked at, and our financial advisor pulls all those fee estimates together and presents that to the city council when we are contemplating a bond sale. So council knows they can see those fees, we haven't paid anything, and it's rolled into the overall estimate of what the savings would be. So the answer is yes. We know that you are, on the bottom line, achieving the savings that were being contemplated when we were looking at those bond sales. On the streets, the gas tax, I think you're talking about the SB1 gas tax, we just started receiving funds through SB1 this year. Those are sales taxes, so they're subject to some fluctuation. We have a capital improvement program we've put together that looks at how we're going to deploy the use of those funds. And we've made a policy decision not to spend them before we have them. So we're putting our dollars together into some funds, and then we'll contract out to utilize those to do different levels of road repair. So the city has actually conducted a pavement management assessment of all the publicly maintained streets in the city, about 143 miles of them. And we know the level of investment that we need to put into those roads to get them to an appropriate level. So the city council at the last meeting authorized us to hire a engineer to develop the specifications that we need to go out to bid for our first phase of our road repairs, which will be happening this year and into next year. So we're in that process now. So we're getting those sales taxes coming in. The first segment is deploying those into our engineering and design for areas that need different road treatments, and then we'll begin deploying that. So we have a list of road projects that were included in the council packet from the last meeting. So you can go online, you can look at that packet and see what roads are there and what kind of treatments that we're looking at, where. So again, we're in that process of design, getting ready to go. And again, to make sure we're not getting over leveraged or we're not getting above our heads financially, as the money comes in, we'll collect that and then we'll go contract out to spend it so we don't overspend. We are finishing up design on Pennsylvania. As we've discussed, it's a 3-phase project. So we have widening from 1st to 6th, which includes some signalization work. That's phase 1, phase 2 are ramps at the interchange of 10 Pennsylvania. And then option 3, or item 3, is ultimately a bridge that goes underneath the railroad tracks. So you have great separation. So the first phase is, the design of that is nearing about 75% complete. We have been in conversations with Caltrans on getting the permits that we need to get that done. So there's some right-of-way acquisition to do. In addition to that, we're working on permits and final design with Caltrans. So that is coming to a conclusion. Part E is actually providing the funds for that construction. Those funds are ready. When we're ready, they're ready to go and fund that and do that. So there's, as you can imagine, with the highway-related project and Caltrans, there's just steps we have to go through to get there. So we're moving as quickly as we can to try to get that done. Every time I come out here, I travel down Pennsylvania, and so fortunately, my oil tank still is in good shape. So I feel your pain there. So it is important to us that we're going as quickly as we can get it done.
Mr. Bart, you had asked for a stop at 6:15. However, we have about 3 or 4 more questions. Is it okay if we continue on?
Please. I'd like to ask 2 questions, but before I do, I want to reiterate what the gentleman said there and request that Eric be given a copy of the presentation on the screen. It was impossible to keep track and try to write everything down. I have, regarding some of the documents on the screen, there are 4 improvement areas, 7A, B, C, and D. If I'm not mistaken, I think 7A is about $2,300 a year. A 1/3, the Mello, Roos, and 7B compared to C and D is about 3 times as much. And what I'm trying to understand is how a home that would be identical in area 7C or D, same square footage, costs much more money, and yet pays a Mello, Roos of about 1/3 less. And I'm trying to understand how the initial setup of the Mello Roos program didn't take into effect equalizing those Mello Roos fees more equitably between 7A, B, and 7C and D. Seems to me that that's an issue, and it probably goes to the way that they were initially structured back in 2012 when they set up the program. And my question is, if I'm not mistaken, state law requires that a Mello Roos district that's set up has expenses that have to be paid directly attributable to the subdivision in question. For example, we wouldn't pay for a signal that's 10 miles away. Is that a correct statement or assumption?
The Mello Roos Community Facilities Act of 1982 provides for general benefit, not specific benefit. So I think what you might be referring to is an assessment district, which requires the debt or original assessment on a property to be tied specifically to the benefit received by that property, whereas a Mello Roos district provides for general benefit, so it does not need to specifically be tied to a property or, a community. So it could be a network of infrastructure that's required to allow that community to be built.
Okay, and it does not necessarily have to be an equitable differential between one block and another block?
Well, the way that the improvement areas, in my understanding, I'm not the one that formed the improvement areas, the way the improvement areas were formed were at separate times. So all of the improvement areas and the rates were not established at the same time. So at the time each development or each improvement area was established, the consultant would look at the policies at that time. So if there is an initial 2% cap, so we don't want to calculate taxes to exceed 2% of the value of that home, they're looking at home prices at the time. So at the time 7A was formed, it's potential to assume that the home prices were at a certain level where without exceeding a 2% cap, they were able to calculate a facilities tax that's higher than when the homes in 7C, that's the CFD or improvement area, was formed, or 7D. We also have one of the improvement areas with significant partial prepayments. So the developer came in and said, we can't sell these homes, the market isn't doing well, so they prepaid a portion of that of the facilities tax, which makes their taxes lower than other taxes. One other component of your question, to kind of elaborate on that, is even within the improvement areas, you have different size homes. And it's a general standard practice to say larger homes have the potential to get more benefit, they'll pay a higher tax. So the taxes are structured such that smaller homes, smaller tax, larger home, larger tax.
Okay, I understand that, I agree with that. 7B pays about $1 million a year toward the Potrero Bridge. Can you tell me if 7C and 7D pay $1 million toward the Potrero Bridge? And secondly, do the master plan developments that are being benefited by the Potrero Bridge, the industrial development that's south of the freeway, and the master plan community, I think it's William Lyon, is it? That's to the north of the freeway, adjacent to the 60, are they paying Mello Roos fees for that bridge?
To answer a part of your question, I can tell you that 7A and 7C, those bonds were issued prior to us coming on board. So I can't give you a definite answer of how those proceeds were spent. At 7B and 7D, we had those final issuance of debt recently, and those proceeds from the bond issuance, I believe, I'll defer to Todd on specifically how those were spent, but it's the proceeds of the bond issuance that are spent on improvements. Your annual payment goes to pay for the principal and interest to a bondholder. So everybody's payment that they make on an annual basis goes to pay principal, interest, and administration. So that's what your facilities tax is paying for, is payment to bondholders and payment for the administration of the CFD. The bond issuance itself is what went to pay for facilities, which could have been completely different facilities for each improvement area.
And I think the specific question there is, out of the bond proceeds that was sold, there was $1 million that was eligible to go towards the return of the project. And that's part of an overall systems established as part, when the CFD was created in total, as part of the facilities plan. But just as Sundance is paying for improvements on Ventura, they're making improvements down here, which directly benefit other areas of the community, Seneca Springs and the commercial area. So there's funds and there's cash coming in that are taking care of different pieces of infrastructure throughout the city. So, so there is an overall system improvement that benefits everybody as a whole. So I think the other question is on the Lion Homes, which is the Olivewood project. They are subject to Mello Roos. They've got, they do not have a facilities CFD established through the city. They have a CFD that they're paying. They've agreed with the school district for an $8 million bond sale to the school district. So there's $8 million to the school district that those folks are picking up that none of the other CFDs in the city have right now. So on top of that, there are additional developer fees which are being collected there. And so there's other regional roadway transportation fees that the developers and ultimately the homeowners are paying in lieu of some of the Mello Roos assessments that are coming in. And so those are what we call dump fees that go to Riverside County Transportation Commission and the Western Riverside Council of Governments that go to fund other regional transportation projects. One of the things that we try to do is negotiate with developers as they're coming in to say, would we be able to negotiate a basis where they keep the dollars within the community and we can put those directly into various projects. And because right now, if you pay the dump fee, those about 50 cents of the dollar goes to the region and 50% is potentially eligible to come back to the city for local projects. But the allocation back to local requires the approval of everybody within the zone. So that includes Cal Mesa, Banning, the county, and the city. So we would rather say, hey, our taxpayers are on the hook for paying that either through a fee or through an assessment. We would much prefer to be able to try to keep that here and to take care of things that we need within our community. So yes, bottom line, everybody's paying, and it goes through a process that happens as we're evaluating those developments and they're getting their entitlements.
Last week you spoke about a lot of the commercial improvements in the city, and I went through and I reviewed several commercial properties that were built during the time, say, the Four Seasons was under development. And there's a huge disparity between the special assessments that the residents are paying and also what the retail commercial property owners are paying. Can you explain that?
I guess I'm not clear on the question that you're asking, because I'm not clear what you're asking, I'm sorry.
The disparity between commercial and residential. So if we take a very high valued retail / commercial property, and we have, in essence, homes that are at $400,000. This commercial property valued at $20 million, their CFDs are virtually small, very small. And can you explain the difference?
Okay, so most of the commercial projects are not located within CFDs. So there's not going to be special assessments on a lot of those. But those commercial developments also bring in additional revenues. There's secured and unsecured property taxes. There's also sales taxes that are being generated through the sales activities that happen within those projects. And there are still impact fees that are assessed, particularly for transportation and other infrastructure that also come into play. And so, in a lot of instances, we work to develop fee credit agreements for some of those. Some of the newer ones, like where Amazon is and I think where Wolverine, there are some additional assessments which come in on those, which are helping to provide a lot of transportation assessments. And those have happened through fee credit agreements through the TUMP program. So as I mentioned, where they're coming in, they've agreed to provide cash to actually help directly fund improvements, and in some instances are making those improvements themselves. So in the newer projects, they're actually contributing and they're helping to address their impacts moving forward.
Question? Anita said this is your last question. We got next. We moved in here in 2005. We bought the biggest house that was in the models at that time. Sales office said we had a small Mello, Roos, which ended up being about 40,000. I sent an email into Web Associates now about 2 years ago asking if we paid this bond off in this tax year, what is an approximate amount of what would we do? My response was $67,000. So my question is, when those of us paid bonds off, I have an email presented to you. When those of us pay bonds off in here, does that work like a mortgage and it stops once you pay it, or are we paying out X amount months of interest on top of that?
Well, yeah, first of all, it's not a simple, we can give you a quick answer on what the prepayment amount would be on a given parcel. So there's a process that Web Associates has to go by to calculate that. So to try to help people decide whether or not they want to prepay, we do a generalized calculation for everybody. So, and it's going to look at overall in your improvement area, what is remaining to be paid off on average. And so, so I presume that your question may have been from a generalized calculation. So, what you've actually paid in your obligation is going to be different based on time of purchase of the house and what's left outstanding. So your actual calculated amount could be different, in some cases significantly different than what the overall average would be because of those various factors that are there. So there is an application process and a fee that you pay in advance to calculate what your actual personal payment would be. So
Okay, so I'm going to venture to guess that the email you received was that estimate of a payment, and it was 2 years ago, so I don't think we even had the estimates up on the website at that time. So Richard, which is probably the one that responded to you, Richard or Monica, and they likely gave you a more conservative number than what it could possibly be. To make sure that they give you a good estimate so you weren't surprised if it was higher if you had decided to prepay. If you'd like, we could talk to you specifically about your parcel and we can give you a more accurate estimate. The question, so the calculation does provide that if you do prepay, that you will be prepaying basically your portion of outstanding bonds. So now that all of the improvement areas, aside from 16.4, have been fully bonded, there is no component in that prepayment that assumes any future facilities. So your prepayment calculation would be based on your portion of outstanding principal, so outstanding bonds, and once you prepay that, you no longer pay that special tax on your property tax bill, and you no longer would be required to pay that interest in the future years. So yes, it does provide the interest savings.
My husband and I have lived in the Beaumont area for 50 years. Prior to moving to Four Seasons 2.5 years ago, we lived on Banning Bench. It was 4 miles from our home to Interstate 10. It took us less time to get from our home to Interstate 10 than it does now from our home here in 7D to Interstate 10 at most times of the day. Through the time that we lived in Beaumont, or in Banning, we watched Beaumont grow significantly. My question is, I actually have 2 parts. My question is, when Beaumont approved all of the new developments, northwest of us, east-west of us, all those new developments that you have approved, did you require the developers to set aside a fund for our streets, our roads? Are they doing anything to help us improve? Because we're getting a lot of traffic from the new development off of Highland Springs Road. And there's another development going in on the east side of Highland Springs Road that's going to affect us even more significantly. So what did the city of Beaumont require of those developers that would help the citizens that are occupying their homes and their businesses? Secondly, do you have a projected year that we can see some improvement on Pennsylvania? Anything to help us get from our residents to where we need to go more quickly? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is, what do developers have to do and what were they required to do? So each development is required to submit an environmental assessment. So their projected development is put together, the effects of that development are evaluated, and then that analysis includes a series of mitigation factors that have to be implemented for the project in order for it to be able to proceed forward to development. And so the way that the improvements work is that if a project meets that environmental requirement and they meet the city specifications, they're entitled, they have a right to develop. You can't prevent them from developing. So the way cities address that is, we've got various level of fees that are established also. They're called impact fees. And so those impact fees are based on certain factors that you use to quantify the effect within that development, which then equates to a dollar figure that needs to be paid. There's a study that goes into establishing what those impact fees are and how you can settle them. There's a process there. We updated our impact fees, I guess in 2017, maybe early 2018. Those fees are adjusted by CPI every year. So January 1, they were updated this year. They'll be updated again January 1, 2020. We'll be restudying those again next year to look at that. So the developers go through analysis. That analysis says what they have to do to mitigate their effect. Their effect, the mitigation for that effect has to be based on a direct nexus. So, you can't, for example, say, we're not approving a project until you build a highway interchange, if that project doesn't require full interchange. So what the analysis does, it says, what is the existing load on the roadway systems that are there? What additional effect does this development have? How much additional congestion or how much additional effect does this have? And is that acceptable based on city standards If it's not, then what are the things specifically that development has to do, whether it's installing a traffic light, widening a road, doing those kinds of things. So that's kind of a localized issue. The other component is that larger transportation issue, and I mentioned earlier the regional transportation fees that are established through our Transportation Commission in Riverside and then the Council of Governments. And that's the TUMP fee. So that takes care of larger regional types of roadway systems. So what we've been doing is taking advantage of the program, the TUMP program has an opportunity to work with developers to ensure that the dollars that are being created through the TUMP program for their projects are being kept and they're being used to make improvements on city roads. For example, Pennsylvania is one of those. We entered into an agreement with Party Homes and we said, hey, we're willing to enter into this agreement with you, help you keep those TUMP dollars here, but we need you to apply those particularly to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one, Oak Valley Parkway improvements is another. The design for the ramps and interchange that we need on Pachero is another. So those are 3 specific projects that we worked with them to try to secure funding for. So that's, in a very quick way, how the process goes through. There's entitlement processes, there's certain restrictions that the city has in terms of withholding developments. It has to be tied back to a study that determines the nexus between what we're requiring them to do and what their actual impacts are. And one of the things that we do is we're staying in contact with our regional partners to say, hey, we've got these ongoing issues. We've got ongoing conversations with Caltrans. Hey, we've got problems that need to be addressed. What are the things we can do to give us the best opportunity to get some highway dollars, some other transportation dollars that we need to get those fixed? Because it's very difficult and really almost impossible for the city to come up with the funding to take care of all these interchanges on our own. And part of the argument is they are regional projects that are beyond a local jurisdiction to do. So we have those conversations going as well. One of the strategies that we are looking at is to get out and to design these major interchanges and get them what they call shovel-ready or as shovel-ready as they can be. And so we go through a process to get through the design and to get them ready so when funds can become available, we have a better opportunity to get to those and get to those funds. So part of this designing and planning and preparing and getting ourselves in a position. So we evaluate the development. Is a development creating an impact? What is it? What has to be done to mitigate that impact? And then where do we go? The service levels that we have established through our codes allow for a certain amount of congestion. And so we know as we approve development and our standards allow a certain amount of congestion to occur, which ultimately results in delays within our transportation systems. So we know that a certain amount that's going to happen as we approve the projects, and our system and our design standards really factor that into account. So there's a variety of things that kind of come together and address that. I'm sorry, what was the last question? It was Pennsylvania. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, we are nearing design on the first phase, which is the widening element of that. We've got some right-of-way acquisition to do. The project we do have planned to get done within the next year and a half. It should be completed and ready to go. That's the plan.
All right, thank you so very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for Webb and Associates. Thank you, and thank you, Eric, for everything. Thank you, guys. And if you have something specific that you need to question, they will be here for about 10 minutes. We did go about a half hour overtime. So if you are already done, then let's give them a big hand. Thank you, and we have our city treasurer here as well. So I know he was all ears. So thank you again. Good night.